Okay, hello everybody. We're going to get started. Okay, welcome to Emory Climate Talks. My name is Eri Saikawa, and I'm an associate professor of environmental sciences at Emory University. It has been a week of extreme weather events, the warming of the Arctic, floods in Europe and Asia, severe drought and extreme heat in the Western US, and the list goes on. Every day we're hearing something about climate crisis, I feel. I'm glad you're here today to discuss what we can do about it together. Emory Climate Talks is made possible by our anonymous donor that supports our trip to the United Nations climate change negotiations. And Emory Climate Talks is in partnership with the Department of Environmental Sciences and the Resilience and Sustainability Collaboratory at Emory University. Thanks to his support, we now have a brand new website, climatetalks.emory.edu, that I hope you would check out. As usual, I would also like to thank Leah Thomas for doing all the work behind the scenes for this website and for Emory Climate Talks in general. Kara Brust has also been helping us with expanding the social media for Emory Climate Talks. Now we have Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn pages as well. Thank you, Kiara. Please check them out and provide feedback to us. We would love to hear from you. Before we go into today's program, I wanted to talk about some logistics and thank all the listeners for your support. Please use the chat function to address any questions you may have to the speaker at any point during the talk. We will have the time for Q&A at the end after the presentation. If possible, we will also let you give your question directly so that you can unmute yourself and ask if you would like. If not, please feel free to use the chat function. Most of the past talks are on the YouTube channel, and you can subscribe at youtube.com/c/Emory Climate Talks. And today's talk is recorded and it will go online in a couple of days as well. I am so excited we have a speaker today on carbon accounting and voluntary market. Dr. Matthew Brander is a senior lecturer, which is equivalent to associate professor in the US in carbon accounting at the University of Edinburgh's Business School. He has an MSc in environmental sustainability, an MSc by research in philosophy of language, and an MA in mental philosophy. His PhD is in carbon accounting from the University of Edinburgh, and also all of his other master's degrees. Dr. Brander is an expert in greenhouse gas accounting, and he has participated in the development of so many international standards for greenhouse gas accounting that I am sure he will tell us about in his talk today. Dr. Brander is also a chapter lead author of the Greenhouse Gas Protocols Policy and Action Standards. I am so excited to hear from him today about the details of greenhouse gas accounting that we are not usually able to hear about. One of the things that fascinates me is his work to ensure that corporate greenhouse gas accounts are accurate and relevant to decision-making. This is so important, and I think we need more discussions on this topic as we think about the Paris Agreement. Dr. Brander, I'm so excited that you can share your expertise with us. Thank you so much for your time, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me as well. So I'll just share my screen. And I hope you can see my slides now.
Yes, we can see it.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks very much. And so the topic that I'm going to be talking about just now is the future of the voluntary carbon market under the Paris Agreement. And in terms of the structure or the agenda, what I'll start off with is just to give an overview of what I mean by the voluntary carbon market, what I mean by carbon credits, and so on, to give you some background context. I'll then go on to talk about a new or major challenge posed for the voluntary carbon market by the nature of the Paris Agreement. I'll then go on to talk about two of the proposed solutions to that problem. And then, in some ways, the main part of the talk will be to look at some of the arguments that are going on about whether this problem is a problem and what needs to be done about it. But I'll explain all of that in due course. So just to start off with, as an introduction to offsetting and the voluntary carbon market, I wanted to start with a definition of what an offset is, or a carbon offset is. And it is an emission reduction or removal enhancement, and I'll explain those terms in more detail in a minute. An emission reduction or removal enhancement that occurs outside the GHG inventory boundary of an entity, and which is used to compensate for emissions occurring within the entity's GHG inventory boundary. So I've got this sort of schematic or diagram here, and on the left-hand side, you've got emissions that might occur within a company or a government's greenhouse gas inventory boundary. So emissions from maybe the combustion of fossil fuel, or emissions from flying. So companies and governments can quantify what their emissions are within their inventory boundary. And then if they want to, or I'll come on to the difference between voluntary and compliance a bit later on, those entities can then invest in or buy certificates from projects that exist outside of their inventory boundary, and they then receive a certificate, and they are able to claim that they have reduced or offset some or all of the emissions within their GHG boundary. The key feature, just to emphasize it, is that these offset projects, crucially, they occur outside boundary of the entity that is buying the offset. And now just to explain what I mean by emission reduction and removal enhancement, an emission reduction project is exactly as it sounds. It reduces emissions relative to a baseline, i.e. what would have happened in the absence of that offset or emission reduction project. And a removal enhancement, as well as, or distinct from reducing emissions, you can have activities that physically draw down and remove CO2 and possibly other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So that's a removal when you have a physical withdrawal of emissions from the atmosphere. And you can have projects, for example, tree planting is maybe a very intuitive example to think about. Trees sequester and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while they grow. And so you can have offset projects which plant trees, those trees then grow and enhance removals from the atmosphere. And both of these can be types of offset project. And now to give a bit more detail, again, building a bit more detail each time, I wanted to share with you what I think is really quite a useful taxonomy of offset project types that's provided by what it's called the Oxford Principles for Offsetting. And it's a group of academics at the University of Oxford who produced a report, and this is part of it. And they make this distinction that I've just made in the previous slide between emission reduction projects and removal enhancement projects. And then the next part of this taxonomy or classification is, well, how is the carbon stored, or is carbon stored? For emission reduction projects, if the answer is no, then you have avoided emissions without storage. And an example of this type of project might be something like projects that capture methane from landfill waste sites and flare, burn off that methane. That's a way of avoiding the emission of the methane, and you're not storing any carbon at all. you're effectively burning methane and releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. Now you can have emission reduction projects that do store carbon, and that can either be short-lived or long-lived storage. So emission reduction with short-lived storage could be something like reduced emissions from deforestation. So you can undertake activities to slow the rate of deforestation. But carbon that is stored through that activity might only be stored for a very short period of time because the trees are still very susceptible to deforestation. A longer-lived emission reduction project might be something like a renewable energy project, which displaces or avoids, say, the combustion of fossil fuel like natural gas or coal. Now, the carbon storage, the carbon that's stored in the natural gas or the coal, is stable and can, in theory, persist in that form indefinitely. So you can have very long-lived storage through that kind of project. And then on the removal enhancement side, you've got, again, this distinction between short-lived and long-lived storage. So removals with short-lived storage might be the tree planting project that I showed on the previous slide, and removals with long-lived storage could be something like using a technology like direct air capture, which physically removes CO2 from the atmosphere through chemical processes, and then you can store that CO2 in geological formations. And again, the storage can be many millennia using that kind of method. So it's a useful taxonomy to be aware of. And now another key distinction that is particularly relevant to this talk is the distinction between what's called the compliance market or compliance offsets and voluntary offsets or the voluntary carbon market. And the thing I'm going to be mostly speaking about is the voluntary carbon offset market. But by compliance offsets, I mean that the entity, that the organization or the government that is buying the offset credit or certificate is required to manage their emissions by law. And so one example of compliance markets or mandatory markets for offsets is when companies are participants within emissions trading schemes like the EU emissions trading scheme or the Californian ETS or RGGI, which is on the east coast of the US, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. I think RGGI stands for that. And the compliance market also applies to governments as well. So this is when governments, in order to meet their obligations, say under the Paris Agreement, they can buy offsets as well. And the fancy name for these is internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. And I'll talk a bit more about the accounting for those offsets in a little bit. Now, also by way of introduction to the voluntary offset market, it's quite useful. I've got a couple of graphs that just look at the amount of activity within that offset market, just to give you a sense of the scale of that offset market and the trends over time. And I guess one of the key trends that I would flag up is that the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market, was really quite buoyant and active, well, just over 10 years ago now, so 2008 to 2010 was a market peak in terms of transaction volumes. And then we've seen a sort of trend of decline up until 2016, 2017. But interestingly, we've seen a big uptick over the last couple of years. And the next chart shows a very similar story to some extent. It shows this very large increase in activity over the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, going back to 2017 now. And this graph isn't showing market volumes, it's showing issuance. So this is the number of credits issued by offset standards to project developers. So this is really the kind of on the ground activity, how many emissions are being reduced or removals are being enhanced. So you can see this number is jumping up rapidly. The amount of actual activity reducing emissions has gone up, and so has the number of retirements. So this is when organizations buy offset credits and retire them. They cancel them within a registry so that they can make claims to have offset their emissions. And actually, I realize I'm going to just skip back a couple of slides because I realize I completely missed out giving you a quick explanation of what I mean by a voluntary offset or the voluntary market. And this is, as it sounds, the entity that's buying the offset credit is managing its emissions voluntarily. It doesn't have to buy certificates. It just does so in order to make normally some claim about carbon neutrality to show its corporate social responsibility. So it's not buying the credit because it has to through some regulatory requirement. It's doing so voluntarily. So anyway, back to the trends. And what we see here is this large increase in interest and activity in the voluntary carbon markets. And maybe I should just briefly mention it just to give you a sense of scale. Issuance here is 142 million tons of CO2e in 2019. So it's not a huge amount of emission reductions. If you think that global emissions are in the region of 40+ billion tons of CO2 per year. So the voluntary market is small in terms of global emissions, but it's rapidly increasing. And those graphs that I've just shown you are looking at historic trends. Looking forward, what we expect to see is that growth trend continuing. It looks like there's extremely strong demand at the moment for more and more voluntary carbon credits. And I guess probably the key source of demand for those credits is from large companies who are setting net zero targets. A huge number, hundreds of the world's largest companies are setting these net zero targets. So they're saying they're going to look at the emissions within their own GHG inventory, and they're either going to reduce those emissions or they're going to buy offsets to hit net zero. And that's looks like a huge source of growth in demand. And the other thing to mention is that there's an initiative or a task force called the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market. And this has been convened by Mark Carney, who was the former governor of the Bank of England. And that task force is predicting a 15-fold growth in the size of the voluntary carbon market by 2030. So things are very buoyant, lots of activity at the moment. But, and this is, I guess, the context for this talk, is there is a problem. Not just on the horizon, there's a problem that's with this market now. And so now I'll come on to talk about this challenge that's created by the Paris Agreement. And essentially, it's difficult to explain this and make it sound like a problem, at least the initial part of the problem. So under the Paris Agreement, nearly all countries have emission reduction targets called nationally determined contributions. And that's the bit that's good. That doesn't sound like that's not a problem at all. It's great that almost every country in the world has emission reduction targets. But this does create a problem for the voluntary carbon market. And it creates a problem of non-additionality by double counting. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So one of the fundamental features of an offset is that it must reduce emissions or enhance removals beyond what would have happened anyway. in order to be an offset and balance residual emissions and have this compensatory effect, the act of buying the certificate must achieve a level of emissions below what would have happened anyway. So that's a fundamental feature for an offset to be an offset. But if the host country, so that's the country where the offset project is located, counts the offset project reduction, so the reduction in emissions caused by the offset project towards its nationally determined contribution, its own target, and that host country would have achieved that target level of emissions anyway by other actions if the offset project hadn't existed, then the project doesn't achieve emissions below what would have happened anyway. It's almost as if the level of emissions, target level of emissions set by the nationally determined contribution creates an emissions floor, if you like. And that floor level of emissions is always going to be achieved, assuming the country is going to achieve its NDC. So if the offset project is nested within that, it helps contribute to the achievement of that NDC, but it doesn't go beyond it. And so it doesn't reduce emissions below the level that would have occurred anyway. So I hope that makes sense. It's a difficult problem to understand. It's a difficult problem to explain, but it is a real and very widely recognized issue now that the voluntary carbon market is currently grappling with. And so that was the problem, this issue of projects not going beyond the emission reduction target levels set within countries' nationally determined contributions. And there are two possible solutions, or there are two main solutions that have been proposed to this problem. And one is to use what's called a corresponding adjustment. And this is when a host government adjusts their greenhouse gas inventory so that they're not taking credit for offsets that are used by other entities. And I've got this, I've taken this graphic here that is really talking about the use of corresponding adjustments as they're used between two different countries. And the mechanism of corresponding adjustment is one that's long established. It was used under the Kyoto Protocol for dealing with what was called joint implementation projects, which were essentially offset projects. And I'll explain how a corresponding adjustment works. So if you have country A, this is where the offsetting activity, the project is located. You have their BAU, or business as usual emissions. And as a country, they undertake direct abatement and they directly reduce their emissions by 50 units. And they're left with actual reported emissions of 50 units. But then they sell offsets. They sell some of the reductions that they've achieved to another entity. And then what they do, and this is the corresponding adjustment part, they add on the amount of emission reductions or offsets that they've sold to their greenhouse gas accounts to give you an adjusted emissions total of 80 units. So the actual emissions within their jurisdiction are 50, but they've sold these offsets, so they then report an adjusted total of 80. And on the buyer side, in this case, a country, you've got their business as usual emissions. They haven't been very successful at reducing emissions, and they're left with this big emissions total, which is probably why they want to buy offsets. And then they get to subtract the amount of emissions from the offset credits, and then they can report an adjusted total as well. So it's a bit like double entry bookkeeping. The transferring country adds on the amount that they've sold, and the purchasing country gets to deduct the amount that they've bought. And the idea is, in terms of the voluntary carbon market, is that this left-hand side part of the corresponding adjustment could be undertaken so that the host country isn't counting the emission reductions from the voluntary carbon project within their own fulfillment of their nationally determined contribution. So if they're aware that there's a voluntary carbon project within their country, that project developer would have to contact the government and say, I'd like to issue this number of voluntary carbon credits. Please, will you make a corresponding adjustment to your accounts? Then that host country would make that adjustment so that the entity that's buying the offsets is the sole user of those emission reductions. The host country would then have an adjusted emissions total like this, and they would have to then undertake more direct abatement and emission reductions themselves to meet their NDC. And that would ensure that the emission reductions achieved by the voluntary carbon project go beyond NDC fulfillment. So I hope that makes sense. I'd be very happy to sort of take any questions and walk through that again if that doesn't make sense. But essentially, corresponding adjustments are a potential solution to this problem for the voluntary carbon market. And perhaps a much simpler solution number 2, is this idea of alternative claims. And this is the point that actually carbon credits or certificates don't necessarily have to be considered offsets. You don't have to say that you've offset your emissions and you've achieved, say, net zero. They could simply represent support for climate change mitigation, so that it would be a little bit like making a charitable donation and saying, I would just like to help a particular host country meet its NDC, and I'm going to provide some finance through the purchase of certificates for projects that reduce emissions or enhance removals. So it means that companies like Google and Amazon and so on, who are setting net zero targets, couldn't use those types of credits to meet their net zero target. They would purely be buying the credits to do a good thing, just to say we've done a good thing and we've supported climate change mitigation. But the key problem with this possible solution is there a market? Is there demand for alternative claims? And that's very questionable, because most of the demand in the voluntary carbon market is from companies who want to make net zero claims, and therefore they need an offset, and therefore they probably need a corresponding adjustment. And one thing I wanted to flag is that there's a very heated and perhaps increasingly heated debate within the voluntary carbon market at the moment on whether this double counting additionality issue is a problem and whether corresponding adjustments are needed. And Defra, which administers the verified carbon standard, which is the #1 voluntary carbon market standard in terms of numbers of projects and numbers of credits issued, they, alongside the trade body, the industry body, CROA, they say we don't need corresponding adjustments. It's not a problem. On the other hand, Gold Standard, which is the #2 standards body, is saying we totally do need corresponding adjustments, or we have to move to issuing credits for alternative claims, not for offsets. So there's this huge debate, argument at the moment within the voluntary carbon market about what is necessary. And so now the final part of the talk, what I wanted to talk about, was just to run through some of the arguments that stakeholders or organizations like Defra and CROA are putting forward to say that double counting is not a problem, and there's no need for corresponding adjustments, or CAs for short. And then I want to offer just a brief critique of the arguments that they're giving.
Sorry, Matthew, can I just stop there? There is a clarifying question, if I could ask you.
Yes. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so Taylor is saying, so it's the issue with double counting that it looks like we're making a larger impact on emission reduction than we actually are.
In a way, I mean, I guess that's probably partly how to express it. I'm just going to go back a couple of slides to where I introduced the problem. The way I would explain it is to say an absolutely crucial fundamental feature of an offset is that buying the credit must reduce emissions to a level that is lower than otherwise would have happened. And the issue with double counting is that if the host government is effectively let off the hook from implementing some other mitigation activity that it would have had to implement to meet its reduction target, then buying the offset credit didn't manage to go beyond the level of emissions that would have been achieved anyway when the host country met its nationally determined contribution. So the problem is that the voluntary carbon market isn't managing to lower emissions below what would have happened anyway. Does that help?
There is another clarifying question, if that's okay. Jordan is now asking, how can we determine what would have happened anyways? Is there a standard method of quantifying this? But if it's better, we can also move to the end as well.
No, yeah, I mean, I can quickly talk about that. I'll come on to additionality tests a little bit in a minute. There are standardized tests for assessing whether a particular offset project would have happened anyway. And actually, I will talk about that in a slide or two. In terms of the level of emissions that would have happened anyway, when countries set emission reduction targets or set their NDCs, they can set them in a number of ways, but increasingly, or the standard way in which countries set those NDCs is to say we will reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030 relative to 2005 levels. So there's a fixed amount of emissions, a level of emissions that is their target, and for this problem, we largely just assume that governments will meet their NDCs. So that's the level of emissions that would have happened anyway. We're assuming that governments will actually step up and meet their obligations. It's very, very hard to say, oh, okay, no, a host government just wouldn't have done enough, and the level of emissions is going to be higher than their target level, in which case maybe a voluntary project could achieve a lower level of emissions, but still a level of emissions above the NDC. There's an element of having to trust and believe that host governments will actually implement their obligations. The problem also arises because, you could say, well, you might have a government that has very lax ambition and was only going to really aim to meet, say, 80% of its target. Now, the same problem arises if you've got a voluntary offset project and that helps the government to meet its 80% of its NDC. It will also effectively take its foot off the gas in terms of climate change mitigation because it sees that it's got this benefit from the voluntary carbon project. But I'll talk a little bit more about additionality tests and how we work out what would have happened otherwise in just a minute. So I'm slightly conscious of time. I've got 6 arguments, and I'll try to run through them without, with keeping it concise and not getting too bogged down. So the first argument from Vera and McCrow is to say, well, direct abatement action counts towards a country's NDCs without the requirement for a corresponding adjustment. So, you know, if a company or organization implements some energy efficiency within its factories, for example, then the host government effectively sees that benefit within its national greenhouse gas accounts, and it counts towards the NDC without any kind of corresponding adjustment. And so if that's true of voluntary direct abatement, it should be true of voluntary offsets as well. That's the argument. And I guess the critique of that is that the logic of direct abatement and an offset is different. For a company, it can reduce its own emissions, its own direct emissions, and say, you know, and show that in its own inventory. And that is also reflected in the GHG inventory of the country where it's located. But the fundamental logic, if you like, of an offset is that it is a compensatory act. It has this feature of needing, or by necessity, it must achieve an outcome beyond what would have happened anyway. Otherwise, no compensation has occurred. You can't say, oh, I've got some residual emissions within my inventory, I'm going to offset them, but actually the thing that I've purchased, the activity I've purchased emissions reductions from, didn't actually reduce emissions below what would have happened anyway. Now that no balancing or compensation has occurred, nothing has changed, no levels of emissions have not changed through that act, so no compensation has occurred. That's the crucial difference with an offset and direct abatement. And now here's the bit where I was going to talk about additionality tests. The other argument against the double counting problem is that people say, well, offset projects go through additionality tests to show that the project would not have happened anyway. And there are a number of different tests for this. One example is an investment additionality test that says, okay, well, was the project, say the wind farm or the solar farm, financially viable without the revenue from the sale of the offset credit? And if it wasn't financially viable, then it would not have happened anyway. And it's the revenue from the offset credit that makes the project happen. So then you can show that buying credit achieved additionality. Now the critique of that argument is that these existing offset project additionality tests are only testing for additionality at the project level. They're only showing that a specific project would not have happened anyway, like the wind farm. But that's not the same as showing that the same level of emissions would not have occurred anyway. And just to kind of briefly put that in, I suppose, tangible terms, you can imagine a host government getting the benefit of a wind farm project that would not have happened anyway without the sale of the certificates. And it's saying, okay, well, that's great. We've met our emission reduction target. We don't need to implement the solar farm that we otherwise would have done to meet our emission reduction target. So you haven't passed an emissions level additionality test there, but you have passed a project level additionality test. And so this argument against the need for corresponding adjustments is questionable. Another argument is that corresponding adjustments would distort the accounting to the Paris Agreement, as reported emissions would be above actual emissions. And part of this is true. And going back to my graph here, what would happen when there's a corresponding adjustment for the voluntary market is that country A, the host country, would add that amount of emission reductions onto its adjusted total, but no other government would then have a corresponding deduction. It would just be sort of lost in ether, if you like. And then if you were to add up the adjusted emissions accounts of all the countries in the world, they would exceed the amount of actual global emissions. So there'd be a disparity between actual global emissions and the amount that's reported in adjusted emissions. But to be honest, you can critique that argument as well. If you really want to add up national greenhouse gas inventories to approximate total global emissions, then you could just use unadjusted pre-corresponding adjustment totals, if that's the purpose. And also, Paris goals are temperature goals and not emission goals. We're not saying we want global emissions to be at a certain level, and therefore we need to check or account precisely what annual emissions are. The Paris goals are in terms of temperature. So this issue of distorting the accounting for the Paris Agreement is questionable. The purpose of accounting for nationally determined contributions is not that they should stack to total global emissions. Is to set targets and ensure that governments have met those targets with the intention of meeting the temperature goals. And then, again, conscious of time, the fourth argument is that requiring corresponding adjustments will limit the growth of the voluntary market. And this is a very sort of just, it's not a technical argument, it's just a pragmatic market reality. And I don't think there's a sort of way of answering that. I think it's probably true that if you require corresponding adjustments, that's going to restrict supply because it might take time before host governments can issue corresponding adjustments. And investors might get wary of that. On the other hand, in the long term, if we try to create a market that doesn't really have any environmental integrity, then ultimately the growth of that market is going to be much more limited. It's not going to be sustainable because eventually awareness of that these offset claims are spurious is going to dent the market more than anything else. And then the final two that I just wanted to quickly go through. Number 5 is that requiring corresponding adjustments is patronizing to developing countries because it's saying that they will be less ambitious or they will hold back on abatement action because they'll be helped to achieve their NDCs through a voluntary carbon market. And you hear, this isn't an argument, either of these arguments are ones that I would subscribe to, but because this debate is getting very heated within the voluntary carbon market, in response, people are saying, well, assuming that developing countries can't implement corresponding adjustments is also patronizing. They're perfectly capable of undertaking this technical process. And then the final one I wanted to touch on is that all voluntary action is aimed at contributing to the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement, and therefore all action, including buying offsets, should contribute to the fulfillment of NDCs, and so corresponding adjustments shouldn't be required. And I think the counter to that is that if the purpose is to contribute to NDCs, then that actually sounds more like the alternative claim type credit is appropriate. And it doesn't really address this fundamental issue that offsets must achieve a level of emissions below what would have happened anyway. It sort of ignores the problem, this argument. And the other thing I would note is that this equivalence that the argument 6 is making between contributing to the Paris Agreement and contributing to NDCs is also questionable, because current NDCs aren't sufficient for meeting the Paris climate, the temperature goals. If you stack up all of the current NDCs, then we're far above the 2-degree level of warming that we need to keep below. And so actually going beyond NDCs is, well, it's not just a good thing, it's essential for meeting the Paris temperature goals. So just to quickly summarize, the Paris Agreement creates this new challenge for the voluntary carbon market, because all countries now have emission reduction targets. So there's nowhere to go for the voluntary carbon market that isn't going to be double counted within someone's NDC. this problem exists at precisely the time that the voluntary carbon market seems to be taking off after quite a few years of decline. And I briefly talked about these two potential solutions, corresponding adjustments and alternative claims, although neither of those are going to be easy or straightforward. And then the final thing that I would flag is that this problem appears to be increasingly contested within the voluntary carbon market. Instead of convergence on a solution, the different sides of the argument appear to be moving apart from each other. And this is likely to remain a problem for, I think for the next sort of 5 years or so at least. So yeah, thanks very much for listening, and I'll stop sharing my screen just now, and I'm very happy to take any questions, and I can always come back to the slides if it's helpful to sort of answer a question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm giving you a round of applause from everybody, but I would like to now unmute if anybody is interested in giving the question yourselves, or feel free to write the questions on the chat box as well. So while we're waiting, let me just make sure that you can unmute yourselves if needed. If you can, if you would like, you can just unmute yourself and speak, or you can raise your hand. The raise your hand button is in the reactions. And then you can go from there to raise your hand so that I can point you for your question. Or if you would prefer, you can use the chat function as well. Yeah, so while we're waiting for the questions to come, I was wondering, is the global stocktake, is that going to be trying to solve the question that you were talking about related to the voluntary market at all?
In a way, the two, I guess the two are connected. The global stocktake is going to be looking at reported greenhouse gas emissions and also reported levels of reductions that have been achieved. And I guess it's more about that's where the problem is going to arise, is if host countries that have hosted voluntary carbon projects are reporting within the global stocktake that they've achieved their emission reduction target, but part of that reduction was achieved through voluntary offset projects, then arguably if that government was going to make sure it met its target anyway, the voluntary carbon market has contributed to achieving that NDC. It's helped to achieve it, but it hasn't gone beyond what would have happened anyway. So yeah, the global stocktake is sort of where where the double counting, double claiming is going to occur unless these corresponding adjustments are made. And it's great actually you mentioned the global stocktake, because there is this argument that I mentioned where opponents to corresponding adjustments say, well, if we do corresponding adjustments, it's going to mess up the global stocktake and the accounting for under the Paris Agreement. And actually, if you look at the modalities and procedures for the global stocktake, nowhere does it say that the sum of all adjusted carbon accounts have to add up to global emissions. That's just not part of what the global stocktake is trying to do. It's just trying to look to see what each individual country's level of emissions is and whether it's meeting its reduction targets.
Yeah, it's going to be so difficult to figure out this voluntary market issue if we are not even able to figure out what to do for the global stocktake itself, I feel. So there's just so much to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, I think, the sort of mechanism for corresponding adjustments has existed for a long time. It's existed, I guess, since the early 2000s under the Kyoto Protocol, when the first joint implementation projects were implemented. So the idea of it and the mechanism has existed for a long time. It's just a question of countries having GHG inventories and adjusted emissions accounts, and a registry, and then also some mechanism for interfacing with the voluntary carbon market and agreeing. So none of that's, I'm not saying it's easy at all, but the mechanisms exist. It's not like we don't have a precedent for how to do this. Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, I feel like the voluntary market is really stuck between a rock and a hard place. They've got this problem, and there are solutions, but they're difficult solutions. And yeah, I think although they're difficult solutions, the market doesn't really have a choice. I don't think it will get very far in just trying to pretend that the problem doesn't exist. I think eventually it will get caught out, and demand for bogus credits will decline.
Yeah, everybody seems very very shy today, but is anybody ready to ask questions? Okay, Jackson is ready. Jackson?
Yeah, Dr. Brander, first, thanks for coming on and joining us on the call. I really enjoyed your talk. One question I had was, within the voluntary carbon market, is there any sort of incentive to fund research that might lead to like innovation that would lead to overall carbon reduction, sort of like renewable energy, over something like direct air capture that seems to be more of a stalling tactic so that we can buy more time?
Good question. To be honest, the voluntary carbon market is sort of the opposite. It's moving away from, say, renewable energy projects, because they recognize that in many parts of the world, renewable energy is just cost competitive anyway. And it's back to this question of what would have happened anyway in the absence of the carbon market. And it's so difficult now to prove that a renewable energy project is additional and needed the revenue from the sale of the credits, because solar and wind are just so economically viable without a carbon market. Whereas the opposite is true for something like direct air capture, which is massively expensive. It doesn't really have any co-product other than the carbon offset credit. It doesn't produce energy in the way that a renewable energy project produces a kind of useful product and an income stream. And so the additionality of direct air capture is really certain. It would never happen if you didn't have the carbon finance. And certainly people like the Oxford principles, the people behind the Oxford principles for carbon offsetting, are really pushing the voluntary carbon market and buyers to buy more long-term geological storage type offset credits like direct air capture, because that technology desperately needs the finance, and they see the voluntary carbon market as somewhere that could provide it.
Do you see that at all as a kind of market inefficiency, where we might be spending a whole lot of financial capital somewhere that might be a dead end in 10 or 15 years, rather than trying to accelerate kind of renewables or another field that might kind of be a higher growth potential for underdeveloped countries to kind of invest in now?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I think one of the key arguments for offsetting any compliance with voluntary offsetting is that it gives people access to abatement at least cost. So rather than doing expensive abatement yourself, you can buy very cheap abatement wherever it's cheapest to do it. That's the kind of classic economic argument for offsetting. And so saying, okay, well, yeah, let's steer away from the really cheap options like maybe renewables and buy the really expensive stuff, yeah, kind of is the opposite of that economic rationale for the offset market. I mean, I think the problem is when abatement gets really cheap, the difference between an additional and non-additional project is just too, the margin is too thin to be certain that you're not just giving money to a project that would have happened anyway. And then there's no environmental benefit to that. You know, if the wind farm would have happened anyway, giving the project developer even more money doesn't reduce emissions, and it's a waste of your money that you could have spent on something else. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Jackson. There's now 2 more questions. First from Jordan, and then we'll hear from Juliana as well. Jordan?
Hey, Dr. Brander, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's a really interesting presentation, and thanks, Professor Sakawa, for organizing this. And I'd love to chat about this for longer, but yeah, we don't have much time here. So I'll kind of keep my question short, but there's a large number of standards organizations these days, of carbon accounting organizations these days. And it seems like there's some discrepancies between them, and there's issues with comparing numbers between organizations. Are there any of these standards organizations or carbon accounting organizations or so forth that stand out to you as sort of the most reliable? And I want to ask a longer question, but we don't really have time, so I'll leave it at that.
In terms of the voluntary carbon market, I guess the one that really stands out is probably gold standard. I think in terms of their integrity, I think they, on this particular issue, they've said, well, we can see that requiring corresponding adjustments might shrink the market for us, at least, you know, in the short to medium term. But we don't care about that. What we care about is the environmental integrity of the market. So, you know, they're willing to do something that will hurt their own sort of semi-commercial interest because they think it's the right thing to do for the climate, essentially. So on the voluntary offset side, yeah, gold standard, I think, are very credible and principled. And then in terms of emissions accounting more generally, I mean, you know, that's a good question, because I mean, there are good organizations like the GHG Protocol that have produced some really good standards, but at the same time, the GHG Protocol have produced some really bad standards as well, like their guidance on Scope 2 accounting. So yeah, I mean, I think you have to, it's always good to come at anything that you read with a critical eye and make your own judgment on whether you think it's good or not.
Okay, I wanted to go to Juliana's question. She says, very interesting updates on the voluntary carbon market and the divergence of point of view between the standards. Knowing that most transferring countries are developing countries, how can these countries position themselves in the debate, knowing that double counting is a real problem and they would not want to constrain their NDC target either? Yeah,
I mean, I think, gosh, I mean, that is a really good question. I mean, I think the way, I suppose, yeah, I mean, the only thing I can fall back on is that the inevitability of corresponding adjustments if the credits are for offsets. There's, you know, although it's difficult, and it's difficult for developing countries, there's just sort of there's no way around that. If the credit is going to be used as an offset, then that is what's needed. I think the other way that developing countries could position themselves on this is to help build the market for alternative planes. And I think, you know, that's quite an interesting proposition. There's this point made that the voluntary carbon market's had, you know, maybe 2 decades to sort of build its awareness and demand for it, what it's selling. And why can't the same thing be done for alternative planes? So developing countries could say, look, you know, we need help. We need carbon finance to meet our NDC. You know, who can set up a platform where you can buy credits, like you would make a contribution to, say, wildlife conservation or something else, to help developing countries achieve their NDCs. And I guess the other thing with that kind of model for the market, although at the moment there's not demand because everyone wants to use offset credits to meet their net zero targets. That's what the market is focused on. With alternative claims, you're not constrained to only buying enough credits to hit net zero. So you don't need to say, look at your own emissions and say, okay, well, my personal emissions are 8 tons of CO2, so I need to buy eight credits. I could say, well, actually, maybe I've got some spare money this month and I'm going to buy 50 credits. I'm not saying that I'm net zero or I'm constrained to buying 8 credits. I just want to do something good for the climate, and I'm not constrained by my own footprint. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many more questions. I'm not sure if it's already quite late for you. Is it okay that we go with a couple more, or should we stop now?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, I'd be happy to take a couple more questions. Yeah.
Great. So Luna is asking, are offset credits issued by different standards, gold versus Vera, priced differently, and are they equally tradable in the compliance market?
Okay, yeah, good question. And so these standards are specifically voluntary carbon market standards. So the credits that they issue generally can't be used in the compliance market. There's a bit of a blurring of that at the moment because standards like Gold Standard and Vera are now issuing credits that can be used for compliance for the civil aviation offset scheme. So that's a kind of compliance market that voluntary credits can be used in. But I want to clarify that primarily those standards are not compliance standards, they're voluntary market standards. And yeah, there is a bit of a price difference. I think gold standard credits tend to sell at a slightly higher price. And that's because their projects generally build in these sustainable development co-benefits. It's one of the key focuses for the gold standard. So they will tend to have things like clean cook stove projects that have really quite significant health benefits by reducing the amount of air pollution. And then buyers are willing to pay a slightly higher price so that they can make the carbon offset claim and also talk about the social and environmental co-benefits they've helped to create. So yeah, gold standard tends to sell at a slightly higher price.
Okay, great. And I think Chiara might have had some questions too.
Hi, I was just wondering if there are any resources that you can provide to businesses or organizations who may be interested in offsetting their carbon, or what you think is the most cost-effective and efficient way of offsetting carbon.
Yeah, there's a really good guidance document produced by the Stockholm Environment Institute. And despite the name, the person who's developed it is actually based in Seattle. I think they're certainly based on the West Coast of the US. So yeah, if you Google Stockholm Environment Institute offset guidance, then there's a big document aimed at mostly organizations or corporates to give advice on what to look out for, what are the different characteristics of offset credits, how to buy, how to contract for offsets, and so on. So in terms of advice, and then in terms of cost-effective strategy, it's a difficult one. I mean, I think all of these offset projects and standards have different attributes, and you kind of have to weigh up what you want. You probably could buy some really, really cheap say renewable energy project certificates or industrial gas destruction projects, for example, for if you're buying a volume, then less than $1 a ton, but then they probably wouldn't have any sustainable development co-benefits, and they might be on the slightly sort of questionable side of additionality. So it sort of depends on, you've got to kind of weigh up, well, if you really want to ensure high additionality and co-benefits, then you need to pay a bit more.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to also point to those that have Emory access. There is a paper that Dr. Brander did on creative accounting on energy policy that I think is a great resource to also look into as well. So
Great.
I've posted that.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. This was a great discussion, and I'm so glad you were able to come tell us about your great expertise on this topic. I think we need so much more discussion, and I think you point out very rightly on the paper that we need much more awareness building on this and how the companies are going to deal with it as well. So thank you so much. And yeah, thank you to everybody. And I hope you stay safe and healthy.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Bye.